So 100 years ago, or I should say at the turn of the century, Mormon women had a network through which they could talk and ask questions. That was a number of magazines, including the Women's Exponent. Um, at least one of these magazines was officially given the thumbs up by Brigham Young. He said, "Yo, we can't pay for it, but here's a calling. You know, you feel good about it. Let's go for it. You women, do your thing." So women wrote these magazines, talking about the life of being a Mormon woman, so domestic things as well as theological things, and even some really progressive things that would really shock women today. 100 years ago, at the turn of the century, Mormon women were some of the most progressive in the country, as opposed to now, Mormon women currently being some of the most conservative in the country. They were rubbing elbows with the likes of Susan B. Anthony. They were some of the early suffragettes in this country, and they were even raising money to send people back east in order to earn degrees and become doctors. So they had this network to talk about what Mormonism meant to them from a female perspective, which is very valid. Girls make up half of your congregation, and giving them a space to discuss the religion is not necessarily a bad thing in my opinion. But it's a network that they had that they slowly lost until it was gone, and they didn't have anything like it for like the better part of 50 years until the internet. And so here's my question. The church has a precedent of excommunicating members who ask questions publicly. They don't want anyone rocking the boat. But with the internet and the ease of access that it brings to information and question asking and just historical facts, can it continue to silence people through making them afraid? Can can they continue to use excommunication as an effective means to control information that their congregations access? I personally don't think that it's possible, and I think that we're actually seeing something that is kind of slow building, but and under the surface, but very much real. It's been said that there are more people leaving the Mormon Church now than basically at any time in its history. And the internet has given people so much access to so much information. You could be like assigned to give a talk, or maybe you are a seminary teacher and you really want to do your research, so you get online and start to do it, and you find out that some things that you thought were very, very simple are actually not, and you're finding them all from church approved sources. They're just not sources that are brought up very much. The church has had a history of really giving certain bits of information a lot of prominence while kind of scooting the more problematic ones to the side. But they're all able, like all of the really big questions that you ask about, like really problematic church issues, they're questions that naturally arise from their documentation, not from any sort of anti-site or any sort of conspiracy theory, but it's straight from the history. And so that's why you have a lot of people who are bishops and a lot of people who are seminary teachers and a lot of people who were missionaries. Those people in those positions represent some of the largest demographic of people who start to question their religion and end up leaving. And it's not because they're tempted by some oogie boogie man. It's because they're trying to do their jobs and they get caught up on a few problems. And so the thing that I think is noteworthy right now is that the internet gives us so much access to information, but it also gives us access to each other. So once again, women, and not just women, but all church members of different stripes, suddenly have this network. And so you see that in the Mormon blogosphere. You see the strength of the discussions happening online, independent of ones that would happen in church. The questions that people are asking, very basic and fundamental ones, but problematic ones, are not tolerated in church. Like if I ask, the Book of Mormon talks about pre-Columbian horses. What do like, how do you explain that? If I ask that in a church, they'll probably end up dodging it and then questioning the efficacy of my testimony. They'll basically say, well, do you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet? Which is a non-answer. They're not answering my question, but it's a way of making me feel bad that I ever thought to ask. So socially, the church has a way, like church members silence each other from asking questions that make them uncomfortable. And the church itself doesn't have any such answers. And that was kind of one of the more trivial examples, but let's not go into the nitty gritty. Basically, the church is not providing a service for its members that is becoming increasingly relevant. Members of the church are able to gain access to all of the information, not just the information that the church wants people to see. They're able to read about different ways that Joseph Smith translated the plates from verifiable sources. They're able to read a lot of things, and the church isn't taking a stand and answering these questions, so the people are left to talk among themselves. And so you've got people like John Dehlin who have a podcast, which the point of his podcast specifically is to talk about them, not necessarily about conclusions. But there are faithful people that listen to it. There are people who have lost their faith that listen to it. It's a resource for basically everybody who really needs that resource. And so should the church punish that resource for being created when it really refused to engage in those subjects directly? I don't think that they're doing themselves any favors by approaching stuff from the same angle that they have. They've gotten very used to controlling information over the years, but the internet has completely blown that all away. So I'm going to really quickly read a thing. I was going to read a paragraph from the church responding to these to what's going on with Kate Kelly, ordained women, and John Dehlin, Mormon stories. They said the scriptures are full of examples of how to receive answers to our questions and find truth and align our will with God's. And that process includes studying, praying, learning, and discussing church doctrines. Millions of people do this throughout their lives. How and why, when asked, is as important as the questions as important as the questions we're asking. What causes concern for church leaders is when personal motivations drive those conversations beyond discussion, and when a person or group begins recruiting others to insist on changes in the church doctrines or structure. When it goes so far as creating organized groups, staging public events to further a cause, or creating literature for members to share in their local congregations, the church has to protect the integrity of its doctrine as well as other members from being misled. So rather than clarifying their positions on complicated issues by making official statements, they will just simply excommunicate anyone who bothers to ask publicly. Not a sustainable tactic, in my opinion. There's no going back. You cannot close the Pandora's box of the internet. And, you could say that maybe they're approaching it this way because they're old and they don't know any better. I don't really know. I'm not going to speak for them. But just dissecting that paragraph for a minute, they are in favor of praying and discussing, but only if it's like in a really, really small group or context. Basically, ask questions, but keep it to yourself is kind of what I took out of it. They are against recruitment, insisting changes, organized groups, public events, and literature. So I'll tackle those one by one. Recruitment. The ordained women movement and Mormon stories don't actively recruit people. They are resources that are sort of there. Ordained women simply exists. It doesn't go knocking door to door saying, hey, do you want to be part of Ordained Women? Or Mormon Stories doesn't say, hey, have you heard about this great podcast? These are things that very much travel by word of mouth and by people talking. They don't have any active, like, evangelical kind of approach to them. And as far as insisting on changes in the religion, I was part of the Ordained Women March in April, and I think it was April, whatever, I forget the time. But I went there to support my aunt. I'm no longer Mormon, but she is, and this deeply affects her, which by extension affects me, and I wanted to go there to support her and all of the women who are bold enough to ask questions publicly like that. So anyway, their approach is not to insist on changes. I was there. They were pretty much saying, will you pray about this? Here we are, we're at the door, we're knocking, will you at least pray about this stuff? Will you consider including us as we were once included, once upon a time, to some extent? Anyway, so like it's less insisting changes and proposing changes. They are a group that simply wants to be present. They don't want to dominate. They just want to be included. So that's a proposal, not insisting, in my opinion. And I guess you can have a different opinion if, there's going to be different ways to interpret this. But as far as the other points, organized groups, public events, and literature, All I have to say is internet, internet, internet. The internet is going to is a place where people can publicly discuss and have events where that discussion takes place and promote ideas and interpretations that you don't directly control. You cannot control literature, you cannot control people, and you cannot control what they discuss. So rather than, in my opinion, me speaking to the Mormon Church, rather than trying to be Big Brother and be as totalitarian in your approach of how to control your members, why don't you, instead of trying to control them, respond to them and start to fill the needs that quite honestly exist, and stop being in denial that these things don't exist. If you ignore people for too long, you'll continue to see the exodus of, I guess, this turn of the century continue to grow. This exodus is, by some bits of information, probably the largest the church has ever seen, and some refer to it as a hemorrhage. I don't have access to that data, but I would not be surprised. Anyway, so feel free to tell me what you think about all this junk, and what you think the church should do in order to handle itself in the age of the internet, and how it can do things better, or how I'm completely wrong. Go for it. Hash it out. Bye.